Mr. Jackson is recognized for 60 minutes as the designated for the minority leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous materials on the subject of this special order. It is with great honor that I rise today to co-anchor this special CBC order hour.
Without objection. Now you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is with great honor that I rise today to co-anchor this CBC special order hour alongside the Honorable Cori Bush of Missouri, founder of the first Congressional Caucus for the Equal Rights Amendment. For the next 60 minutes, members of the CBC have an opportunity to speak directly to the American people on finally getting the equal rights across the finish line and recognized as the 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, 100 years after it was first introduced in the House of Representatives. An issue of great importance to the Congressional Black Caucus, Congress, the constituents we represent, and all Americans. I rise today to celebrate and honor the incredible efforts of African American women who have advocated for the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, throughout history. Their resilience, passion, and determination have driven the relentless pursuit of gender equality and justice for all. In the 1970s, prominent black women like Paula Murray, Shirley Chisholm, Flo Kennedy, and Barbara Jordan were instrumental in advancing the cause of women's rights and the ERA. When the 28th Amendment is finally recognized as part of the United States Constitution, black women deserve to have significant credit for its passage. Their legacy reminds us of the power of unity, conviction, and perseverance in the face of adversity. Let us not forget the profound words of feminist lawyer and civil rights advocate Paula Murray, who testified for the ERA at a 1970 Senate Judiciary Committee hearing. And she said, as a constitutional lawyer, a woman, and a black person, I can say with conviction that black women as a group have the most to gain from the adoption of the Equal Rights Amendment. Let us draw strength from these words of Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, who proclaimed in her speech in 1970, I am for Equal Rights Amendment. This is what it comes down to. Artificial distinctions between persons must be wiped out of the law. Legal discrimination between the sexes is, in almost every instance, founded on outmoded views of society and the pre-scientific beliefs about physicology and psychology. It is time to sweep away these relics of the past and set future generations free of them, Mr. Speaker. Let us be inspired by the words of Representative Barbara Jordan, who said the Equal Rights Amendment is a mandate for change. It is a standard by which to measure all future legal and social constructs. The Equal Rights Amendment is for men and women. It is a constructive force for liberating the minds of men and the place of women. It is inclusive. As we pay tribute to these trailblazing black women, it is crucial to recognize that the fight for gender and racial equality is still ongoing. The number of black women in Congress remains disproportionately low compared to the diverse population they represent. As of today, only 57 women of African American ancestry out of 12,505 people to have served in this august body have ever served in this Congress, a mere fraction of the total number of representatives and senators who have shared and served throughout our nation's history. Only 2 African American women have ever served in the Senate, and none in the governor's mansion. The senators, Democratic Congresswoman Carol Moseley Braun, Democratic Senate Ms. Carol Moseley Braun of Illinois, elected in '92, and current Vice President Mrs. Kamala Harris. This underrepresentation is a call to action for all of us, a reminder that we must continue to strive for a government that is truly representative of the people it serves. We must also recognize that the fight for gender and racial equality is not limited to the halls of Congress. Across our nation, countless black women and women of color continue to face barriers in access to education, and access to health care, and access to employment opportunities, and access to equal pay. The struggle for justice and equality is a daily battle fought by millions of women who refuse to be silenced or sidelined in their pursuit of a more just and inclusive society. It is our responsibility as citizens and as leaders to ensure that the voices of black women and women of color are heard, their concerns are addressed, and their contributions are acknowledged and celebrated. We must work together to dismantle the systems of oppression and discrimination that continue to hold back so many of our sisters, daughters, mothers from reaching their full potential. And so, as we continue to push forward, let us remember the words of the great civil rights leader, Reverend Martin Luther King, who said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Let us then bend that arc towards justice together and make equal rights amendment a reality for all. In the name of all those who have fought for justice, for equality, and for the rights of women, let us say amen. Amen. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, it is now my privilege to yield to the Honorable Cori Bush of the state of Missouri, and I thank you.
St. Louis and I rise today for the Equal Rights Amendment. We rise on this historic occasion on the eve of the birth of the Congressional Caucus for the Equal Rights Amendment, a caucus I am proud to be founding tomorrow alongside my co-chair in service, my sister in service, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. We rise in the tradition of those who led this fight before us, those whose shoulders we now stand upon, shoulders like Pauli Murray, Shirley Chisholm, Barbara Jordan. On the ERA Caucus Eve, this ERA Caucus Eve, as we near the close of Women's History Month, it is only fitting that we are here on the floor of this U.S. House of Representatives with our Congressional Black Caucus colleagues, because black women have always been leaders of the fight to enshrine equality in our nation's Constitution. But we haven't always been in the headlines for leading that work. So today, we are here to declare that the reason the ERA is a priority for the CBC is because everyone in our communities has something to gain from its finalization, and black women, girls, and queer folk have the most to gain. We are here continuing to lead, demanding exactly what is owed to us, equality. Because you see, the Constitution, in all its wisdom, guaranteed fundamental inalienable rights, but it stopped just short of guaranteeing those rights for everyone. Women, we were written out. And black women, not only were we written out, but too many authors of the Constitution were busy enslaving, exploiting, and extracting the labor of our ancestors for profit, and were unconcerned with what is owed to us. Equal rights, nothing less. We need to start by being honest about who is harmed the most when equal rights are not enshrined in our Constitution. We know that without the ERA, the patchwork legislation that we have in place to protect women, including provisions of the Equal Pay Act, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title IX, and the Violence Against Women Act, has primarily benefited and made gains for white women. Now is the time to build on those gains and expand protections for all women and LGBTQ plus folks, all of us too. This is our moment. 100 years since the ERA was introduced in this body. 100 years. This is our moment to finalize the ERA so that we modernize the Constitution and make sure the fight for equality not only includes but centers the people who have been left behind because we were written out of this document. 100 years, and all we're asking for is 24 words. In 24 words, 24 simple ones, the Equal Rights Amendment will add to our Constitution that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's it. In other words, this amendment would make the we the people become us, all of us. In doing so, the ERA can protect people from gender-based discrimination while simultaneously acting as a vehicle for progress. We see it here. This is just a portion. It can work to ensure permanent protections like fair wages, like violence prevention, like healthcare equity, like reproductive freedom, like LGBTQ plus rights, and like much else we not only deserve, but are entitled to and are owed. Equality and nothing less. That's what we're asking for. But we need the ERA, and we need it now, because equality is overdue. Equality is overdue. I rise in support of the Equal Rights Amendment today on the shoulders of the scores of Black women and LGBTQ plus people who have toiled on this initiative for 100 whole years to amplify their calls they made in this very chamber and outside of it, calls that resonate today even as the attacks against us intensify, calls to publish the ERA now. Publish the ERA now. Publish the Equal Rights Amendment now, because equality is overdue. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the Honorable Congresswoman Cori Bush for her remarks. I would like to yield controlling the balance of time to my distinguished colleague, the Honorable Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee of the state of Texas.
Let me thank the distinguished gentleman for his leadership and very important and humbling experience to be able to, may I have that poster, please? The one you just moved. Excuse me. Very important topic this evening that brings us all together. And let me thank Congresswoman Cori Bush for the vibrancy, along with Ayanna Pressley, in the organizing of the ERA caucus. And it is important that we work together to ensure that the Equal Rights Amendment becomes law. I'm reminded of my entering Congress, and I don't know if anyone would realize that there was a statute for suffragette women, women in the early 1900s who were seeking for the women's right to vote. Even earlier than that, Sojourner Truth, who we galvanized around with the National Congress for Black Women to provide an opportunity for Sojourner Truth to even have a statute here as an early suffragette and an abolitionist. When I came, the statute honoring women who fought for women's rights and the right to vote was in the basement. And it was women, members of Congress and the Senate, that had to organize and fight to lift that very awesome sculpture out of the basement, covered by dust, to be able to be put in the rotunda. We still have work undone because it was a half-finished sculpture. And African-American women argued that they did not have Sojourner Truth in that statute, who was an abolitionist and a leader on women's rights. We did, through legislation, myself and Senator Clinton, we did, in fact, get a statue sculptured by an African-American woman of Sojourner Truth. She now remains in Emancipation Hall, and our task is not yet finished to be able to place her in the rotunda along with the other statue. But I say that to say that this caucus, this announcement couldn't be more important. And the reason is because black women were very instrumental in having the loudest voices, realizing that even then, black women had the lowest per hourly wage. Black women were still domestic workers. Black women were not, in fact, equal in many aspects of the law. Pauli Murray, who I honor, Shirley Chisholm, Flo Kennedy, all of whom I remember and know, and Barbara Jordan are a few of the prominent black women who have advocated for the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s. Many black organizations endorsed the ERA, including the National Black Feminist Organization, the NAACP, the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, and 1970s Gallup polls showed that 60% of black women wanted the ERA. This has been a long history, and there's a long history of activism that black women and women of color in support of women's rights and the ERA, stated by historian and professor of Africana Studies, Dr. Mary Phillips. Today, black women still play a critical role in pushing for the ERA. In 3 states to recently ratify the ERA, black women were at the forefront. Nevada Senator Pat Spearman led the successful campaign for ratification of the ERA in her state in 2017, and Representative Juliana Stratton made extensive floor speeches in support of the ERA in Illinois. And as well, Jennifer McKellen led the successful effort to ratify the ERA in Virginia, finally bringing the total ratification of the ERA to 38 states required to become part of the Constitution. And yet, we did not make our mark. Yet, we have more work to do. Yet, we are struggling to ensure that in 2023, black women will have equal rights in the court. Black women will have equal rights in health care. Black women will have equal rights in education. Black women will have equal rights in the issue of sexual assaults and rape when women are charged with agreeing or consent, which is not true. Equal rights to be heard, equal rights in work, equal rights in payments. And so I rise today to support my colleagues and really to acknowledge these brave and historic women. So proud that my predecessor, the Honorable Barbara Jordan, was one of those who stood regally tall, along with the first African-American woman in the United States Congress, Shirley Chisholm. And then, of course, Flo Kennedy. Who could forget Flo Kennedy wearing those hats? And feminist lawyer and civil rights advocate Pauli Murray, who testified for the Equal Rights Amendment at a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing in 1970. In her testimony, Murray drew up upon her own experience of race and sex. And these are her words. Although my motivation, energy, and effort to meet the higher standards of performance have been operative throughout my life, I have experienced numerous delays in my career, not for the traditional reasons given for the failure of women to develop on par with men in our society, marriage, childbearing, etc., but by combining a combination of individual and institutional racism and sexism, Jim Crow and June Crow. As a constitutional lawyer, a woman, and a black person, I can say with conviction that black women, as a group, have the most to gain from the adoption of the Equal Rights Amendment. All that has been said about the frustration and deprivations of American women, generally because of discrimination by reason of sex, can be said with special force about the position of black women. And so my concluding remarks, maybe she didn't call herself a fighter for the ERA, but Harriet Tubman was a fighter for justice and took slaves out of the Deep South. And her words were this: if you hear the dogs coming, keep on moving. If you hear the noise, keep on moving. If you see the lights, keep on moving. Because if you want a taste of freedom, keep on moving. Tonight, we stand here for freedom in the Equal Rights Amendment. With that, I yield back, and I thank the distinguished gentleman for his kind yielding at this time. Thank you.
I thank the Honorable Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee for those outstanding remarks. I would like to yield controlling the balance of my time to the Honorable Ayanna Pressley of the state of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Congressman Jackson, and I'm so appreciative that we have male colleagues like you who do see this as a shared fight, and we appreciate your leadership and partnership in this moment. Of course, I want to thank my sister in service, my partner in good on so many issues of consequence, Representative Cori Bush, for your leadership, your ingenuity, and your partnership. I never grow tired of your saying, St. Louis and I rise, for I know every time that you say that, St. Louis and those that are the most marginalized, ignored, left out, and left behind are being advanced in that moment, that justice is on the way. As Black women who have earned the right to be members of this august body, we find ourselves at the intersection of both race and gender. Some of the most profound and most impactful policies come directly from our lived experiences. Each day as we walk these sacred halls of power, we see statues and portraits of white men that serve as reminders of the inequality and the lack of parity in these halls, in our nation's past and present. For centuries, the contributions of Black women have been excluded from the narrative and marginalized in history, but not today. Today, there will be no erasure. We will give all the flowers to Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan and Polly Murray. Black women, they believed, are inherently valued and our equality is a necessity. And they advocated for the ERA to codify those truths in our Constitution. But ratifying the ERA is not only about history, it is about the here and now. Black women are still organizing at the forefront of the women's rights movement. Zakiya Thomas, Christian Nunes, Melanie Campbell, Fatima Goss Graves are community builders and organizational leaders that are working daily to get the job done. Black women, justice seekers, truth tellers, pace setters, table shakers, always doing the work of liberation, even when our own was often sacrificed. I feel especially encouraged and emboldened that Black women are a part of the multi-generational and multiracial coalition leading and working in an intersectional way to advance policy change. This Congress, I introduced a joint resolution to finally make the Equal Rights Amendment the 28th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America, but I did not introduce it alone. I was joined by Congresswoman Kamala Dove, Madeline Dean, Sylvia Garcia, Abigail Spanberger, and of course, my partner in good, my sister in service, and co-chair of the Equal Rights Caucus, Representative Cori Bush. When the Equal Rights Amendment was put forward 100 years ago, the coalition was not as diverse nor as inclusive. As a Black woman who has experienced firsthand many of the daily indignities of an unequal society and heard stories from my mother, Sandy, may she rest in peace and power, who throughout her career had to train men who were paid more and promoted over her, I know how transformative the ERA will be for millions of women and our LGBTQ siblings across this country. It is long past time the Constitution affirms our equality and our very existence in the eyes of the law. The ramifications run deep as women face daily sexism, pregnancy discrimination, pay inequities, sexual violence, and persistent legislated attacks on our bodily autonomy. We need the ERA now. So I stand stridently with my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus and my co-chair of the new ERA caucus to demand that Congress does its job, pass our resolution, and codify the Equal Rights Amendment into the U.S. Constitution. I have no doubt that in short order, there will be a calendar one day that will cite, on this day in history, the ERA caucus was established. Well, I look forward to the day that there will also be a calendar that notes, on this day in history, the ERA was passed. And I yield.
I thank the Honorable Ayanna Pressley for her advocacy, and I appreciate her remarks. I would like to yield controlling the balance of my time to the Honorable Congresswoman Joyce Beatty of the state of Ohio. Congresswoman Beatty. Thank you, Congresswoman Beatty, for your service.
Mr. Speaker, to our Special Order Congressional Black Caucus Chairman, Congressman Jonathan Jackson, it is my honor to stand here with you to thank you for your leadership and for all that you are doing, and to be a black man standing, talking about the Equal Rights Amendment with us as members of the Congressional Black Caucus. It also gives me great pleasure, Mr. Speaker, to be here tonight as the 9th woman to chair the Congressional Black Caucus, standing alongside with my colleagues as we pay tribute to countless advancements, achievements, and hard-fought victories by black women to advance the Equal Rights Amendment. But let me just say, what an honor to thank Chairwoman of tonight's Special Order Hour, Congresswoman Cori Bush, and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. You will hear tonight the words like sojourner, truth tellers, fighters for freedom. That is just what you are. My sister, my friend, thank you for all that you do. We stand here tonight on the heels of Black History Month, in the heart of Women's History Month. And we do so at such a critical time in our nation's history. You see, we stand on the shoulders of giants, sheroes who paved the way for the fight for civil rights, women's rights. Today, women like us in this room and countless women across the nation, women like Mary Church Terrell, unbought and unbossed Shirley Chisholm, Barbara Jordan, Flo Kennedy, Polly Murray, Eileen Hernandez, who were instrumental in elevating the cause of women's equality and the ERA. Women like we've heard about already, Senator Spearman to Lieutenant Governor Stratton to our very own Jennifer McClellan of Virginia. Black women led the way. And it's interesting when we say, what did it get us? Whose shoulders do we stand on? It seems fitting for me to say today, as we bring members of Delta Sigma Theta sorority to the Capitol to fight for some of those same rights, as they did in 1913, when, yes, it was 22 black women who brought up the rear of the march for the women's suffrage march. It's important for me to highlight today on this chart, 9 women have served as leaders of the Congressional Black Caucus, making history, fighting for equal rights. But for that, we would not have, as noted here, Vice President Kamala Harris, Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. We would not have 2 black women in America today, CEOs of 100 Fortune companies, just 2. We would not have in the halls of this Capitol 2 women, statues, Rosa Parks, brought to the Capitol by members, us, fighting for justice. We would not have from the state of Florida one of their 2 statues, Mary McLeod Bethune, nor would we have the only woman when we started, 1971, the Congressional Black Caucus, no other than Shirley Chisholm. And nor would we have Edna Charity Early, the first black officer in the Women's Auxiliary. So we've come a long way, and we could put petitions and posters around this whole chamber of why we come today. So let me conclude to say I am joining my colleagues to demand Congress to act, to finally adopt the Equal Rights Amendment into the United States Constitution, because as I love saying, when women succeed, America succeeds. And the late Maya Angelou stated, each time a woman stands up for herself, without knowing it possibly, without claiming it, she stands up for all women. Today, Congresswoman Bush, Congresswoman Presley, we stand up with you. I yield back my time.
I sincerely thank the Honorable Congresswoman Joyce Beatty of the state of Ohio. I would like to yield the controlling balance of time to my esteemed colleague, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke of the great state of New York. Congresswoman Clarke.
I thank the gentleman from Illinois, Jonathan Jackson, for yielding me time. Mr. Speaker, I rise on this day to acknowledge and thank Congresswoman Cori Bush and Congresswoman Ayanna Presley for their unyielding, unflinching, unapologetic leadership, for leading the charge on the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. I rise today to reaffirm the ever-present need to have this ratification take place, as well as to recognize the tireless efforts and work of Black women on behalf of that mission. It was more than half a century ago that the ERA first passed Congress, due in large part to the efforts in drafting, advancing, organizing by trailblazing Black women. With that said, I'm reminded of the words written by one of my congressional predecessors, Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, decades ago in the very spot that I stand right now. And I quote, "Of course, laws will not eliminate prejudice from the hearts of human beings, but that is no reason to allow prejudice to continue to be enshrined in our laws, to perpetuate injustice through inaction," end quote. Folks, we are tired of the inaction. We are tired of the injustice. We are tired of being tired. And so it is my privilege to join the first ever Congressional Equal Rights Amendment Caucus in history and support legislative efforts to affirm the ERA as the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. For decades, Black women have continued to pave the path towards ratification. And I'm proud to see we are carrying on that legacy today. So in closing, I want to thank every woman who has played a significant and substantial role and continue to play their positions in this battle and in this fight for equal rights. And as the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey has admonished us, to each and every woman out there, forward ever, backwards never. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Jonathan, I yield back.
Thank you. It is my privilege to recognize the Honorable. I want to thank Congresswoman Yvette Clarke for her outstanding remarks. It is now my privilege to yield my time to the Honorable Congressman Payne from the great state of New Jersey. Donald Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Jackson, from the great state of Illinois for the opportunity to speak with you today. Also, let me acknowledge my colleagues that are leading this fight, the Honorable Cori Bush from the great state of Missouri, and the Honorable Ayanna Pressley from the great state of Massachusetts, and all the women that have held us down in the struggle. There would not be the great strides of African American men if it were not for African American women. And I understand that, and I appreciate that every day. I rise today to discuss the tremendous work of African American women in the continued fight to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. And I want to thank, once again, Representative Bush for hosting this special order hour tonight. This Equal Rights Amendment is one of America's most important pieces of legislation. The amendment would guarantee equal and legal rights for all Americans, regardless of gender. And as amazing a document as it was, it is amazing how many people were left out of it. It was written 100 years ago by Alice Paul, a New Jersey advocate for women's rights. Well, first I meant the Constitution left so many people out, but Ms. Paul, a New Jersey advocate for women's rights, was the author. There have been several prominent African American women who have made significant contributions to the nation's fight for equal rights, the Equal Rights Amendment. Pauli Murray was a lawyer and a civil rights advocate who wrote the book, States, Laws on Race and Color. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall called her book, the Bible of the Civil Rights Movement. Shirley Chisholm was the first African American woman in Congress, and she was introduced dozens of bills for gender and racial equality. Flo Kennedy challenged the representation of African Americans in the media and advertising. Barbara Jordan was a lawyer and the first African American woman from the South to be elected to Congress. And many of my colleagues, many of my congressional colleagues continue their fight for women's rights every single day. I am proud to be from a state with a long history of support for women's rights. In 1790, New Jersey was the first state to enfranchise women in its constitution. Then New Jersey's constitution was written in 1947 to include equal rights for women. But that was only white women. In New Jersey, equal rights have been the law for 76 years. And thanks to New Jersey's constitution, it is impossible to take those rights away. That is why we need a national Equal Rights Amendment. And I'm so proud of the gentlelady from Missouri for spearheading this fight. It would keep extremist legislators from taking the hard-earned rights of women away from them. But if you look now in what's going on in this country, there is an effort to take the rights away from many people, making it harder to vote, eliminating polling sites in minority areas, not allowing people to get drinking water handed to them from someone else. There is already an assault on turning the clock back. Is that what making America great again is all about? Returning to a day where people don't have the equal rights? Making sure that minorities have a more difficult time exercising their right? Everyone thought that Roe v. Wade was the accepted law of the land. And look at where that has gone. Chipping away at rights slowly but surely. And why, when African Americans got the right to vote, why was it only for a period of 25 years? And then we have to revisit this topic every 25 years. Should we let blacks vote or should we not? That baffles me. That absolutely baffles me. Why was it not just made the law of the land and forget about it? Well, it's because of times like now where we see what is going on. We're turning the clock back. We're questioning whether or not people should have the equal right to vote. We're in a very dangerous time in this country. People arming themselves with AR-15s. Someone requesting that that be made the national gun of this country. We're in a very dangerous time. And now the extremist Supreme Court has taken the fundamental right to determine their own health care away from them, their own bodies. One day you say that the government is too much in your business and your privacy, but you want to go take a woman's right to her health care. You want to be involved in that. But you don't want the government involved in anything that's important to you. But you feel you have the right to determine what another woman does with her body. It's hypocritical. It's hypocrisy. We must not let the legal rights that women deserve be taken away from them. That is why we must pass the ERA, and we must pass it now. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of the time.
I thank the Honorable Donald Payne Jr. for his remarks. It is now my privilege to yield the Honorable Congresswoman, can't see. So, Mr. Speaker, may I ask for the balance the remainder of time?
The gentleman has 18 minutes remaining.
I'd like to yield the balance of the remainder of my time for the Honorable Alma Adams of North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, let me thank the gentleman from Illinois for co-hosting this special order hour with the gentle lady from Missouri. And I do want to thank her, Representative Cori Bush, as well as Representative Presley, for spearheading the ERA and for working toward this fight for all of us. I rise today to observe Women's History Month and to reiterate this year's Black History Month theme of Black resistance. And since we last celebrated Black History Month and Women's History Month, Ketanji Brown Jackson became the first Black woman on the Supreme Court. Beyonce claimed the record for most Grammys won in a lifetime. Serena Williams retired as one of the most accomplished athletes of all times. Congresswoman Summer Lee became the first Black woman to represent Pennsylvania in Congress, and Jennifer McClellan became the first Black woman Congresswoman from Virginia. In my home of Charlotte, North Carolina, Vi Lyles made history as both the longest-serving woman and the longest-serving Black mayor in our city's history. And in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, my friend and mentor, the late Annie Brown Kennedy, the first Black woman to serve in the North Carolina General Assembly, passed away at the age of 98 after a long and storied career. These women joined the legacy of other women we're celebrating here today, the women who helped lead the movement for the adoption of the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment is still absolutely necessary because according to the Constitution, we are not equal. Well, just look at the Dobbs decision. Look at all of the legislation from the state to the federal level that aims, intentionally or not, to tell women what they can do with their own bodies. And look at the maternal health crisis in America. Even as science, technology, and healthcare make amazing advances, the number of women dying due to childbirth is going in the wrong direction, and Black women have mortality rates that are 3 times that. As Women's History Month comes to an end, we must continue to teach the history of women, of Black women, Indigenous women, LGBTQ women, and women of color from the halls of our campuses to the halls of Congress. Because if you learn women's history, you learn very quickly how far we've come and how much farther we have to go. Each of us have a role in this history. If you learn this history, teach it. If you live this history, make it. So join me and join us, join the CBC and all of my colleagues in renewing the push for the Equal Rights Amendment and equality for women, not only in the United States, but across the world. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the gentleman from Illinois. I yield back. Thank you very much.
I thank the Honorable Congresswoman Alma Adams for her remarks. It is now my privilege to yield to the Honorable Congresswoman Shontel Brown from the state of Ohio.
Thank you so much. Mr. Speaker, thank you to my wonderful colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus for organizing this session tonight. I join them today in recognizing the significant contributions of Black women to the advancement of the Equal Rights Amendment. Of the more than 12,000 Americans who have served in Congress, only 58 have been Black women. Remarkably, despite our historic and continuous small number among the members of the House, Black women have often been the driving force behind significantly policy shifts that have paved the way for change. Among those achievements are landmark bills like the Equal Rights Amendment, championed by Black women since its inception. A hero of many Americans inside and outside Capitol grounds, Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm was a relentless advocate for equal rights in America, nicknamed Fighting Shirley. She stood on this very floor in her first term and decreed that the ERA was destined to become the law of the land. Today, we honor her legacy by advocating for the long overdue ratification of the ERA. Congresswoman Chisholm did not stand alone in her fight for equal rights. From educator and activist Mary Church Terrell in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to Congresswoman Barbara Jordan in the 1970s, Black advocates for women's suffrage helped drive the ERA forward. In recent years, we've seen leaders fight for state ratification of the ERA, including our newest colleague, Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan, who, along with 2 Black female colleagues, State Rep. Carol Foy and fellow State Senator Mamie Locke, led the final charge that resulted in Virginia becoming the 38th state to ratify the amendment in 2020. And that legacy lives on as my colleagues in the 118th Congress maintain and build on the work of our predecessors. With Representative Presley's efforts to remove the constitutional deadline for ratification and Representative Bush's leadership of the first ever Congressional ERA caucus, we are closer to ratification than ever before. I stand in awe of the power, strength, and contributions of these trailblazers and icons, both past and present. As we continue the fight today, it is an honor to work alongside my Democratic Women's Caucus colleagues to enshrine the ERA in the Constitution, continuing the legacy work started by the Black women who came before me. Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm envisioned the ERA as the law of the land in 1969. She once said she wanted to be remembered as a woman who dared to be a catalyst of change. And she will always be known as just that, Like our ancestors Terrell, Chisholm, Jordan, and more, Black women will continue to help lead the charge, but we cannot do it alone. So to my colleagues who have yet to join us in championing equal rights, I say to you, dare to become a catalyst of change with us. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
I would like to thank the Honorable Congresswoman Shontel Brown for her remarks. It is now my privilege to yield to the Honorable Kamlager Dove, Congresswoman from the City of Los Angeles, State of California.
Thank you, brother, friend, Congressman Jackson from the great state of Illinois, for managing this Congressional Black Caucus Special Order Hour and standing with your sisters. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to celebrate the work that my CBC colleagues are doing as we continue fighting to enshrine the Equal Rights Amendment into our Constitution. The ERA was sent to the states for ratification in 1972. As we reflect on the 100 years since the ERA, attempts to ratify the amendment each year have faded. What's old has become new again, but the state of gender equality in our country has sadly remained unchanged. Why all the controversy? And why such difficulty in giving women the protection of the Constitution that should have been given to us long ago? It is 2023. There is no reason that an arbitrary deadline should prevent women from having basic fundamental rights under the Constitution. Around the country, women, especially women of color, continue to face discrimination in healthcare, in the workforce, in the boardroom, in the schools, and in everyday life. Enough states have finally ratified the ERA, but it is past time that it becomes an official part of our Constitution and give every woman in America full protection under the law. So if you support women, you should support the ERA. And if you don't support women, stand up and say why you don't think your mother, your daughter, your sister, your aunt, your grandmother deserves equal rights. My colleagues, Representative Cori Bush and Representative Ayanna Pressley, have led a renewed charge to add a 28th Amendment to our Constitution and enshrine the ERA into law. I thank them for their commitment to confronting gender equality in the face of disheartening challenges. The first ever Equal Rights Amendment Caucus is dedicated to this cause, and as Vice Chair and co-lead of Representative Pressley's resolution, I stand arm in arm with my colleagues as we bring this battle home. I'm going to say this charge is being led by Black women. Historically, we are the ones who take up the mantle of equality and fight to not only uphold our democracy, but to move it forward. Abolition, suffrage, civil rights, all of these movements supported Black women even though they were not always recognized for their leadership and courage. A glaring irony of gender discrimination. I'm going to say the names again. Mary Church Terrell, Shirley Chisholm, Pauli Murray, Nevada Senator Pat Spearman, and even our own Jennifer McClellan. These activists have led fierce fights for gender equality to uplift Black women and women across the country. In fact, Pauli Murray once said, "If anyone should ask a Negro woman in America what has been her greatest achievement, her honest answer would be, 'I survived.'" We must recognize the work of these pioneers as we continue their fight today. The ERA would allow Congress, federal agencies, and courts to address the needs of women as they relate to pay equity, pregnancy discrimination, sexual harassment and violence, abortion access, and LGBTQ protections. Because women are insulted, harassed, demeaned, demoted, and assaulted just for being women. So enshrining these rights brings our Constitution into the 21st century. We might have been written out, but don't count us out. We will persevere until we can finally celebrate the addition of a 28th Amendment to secure equal rights and a better and brighter future for our children and the women that we love. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the Honorable Congresswoman Sydney Kamlager-Dove for her remarks. It is now my privilege to yield to the Honorable Member from the great state of Pennsylvania, Congresswoman Summer Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, acknowledging and thanking our convener, the gentleman from Illinois, and the bold and brave women, our colleagues Cori Bush and Ayanna Pressley, who have put together this convening as well, and also all the women on whose shoulders we stand, particularly those who brought an intersectional perspective and urgency to the fight for all women throughout this country, but also adding on to that urgency and reminding that it's Women's History Month in the year 2023, and yet we pretend to be surprised that a document written by rich, land-owning white men in the 18th century does not protect my rights. We pretend to be surprised that a document that saw my black ancestors as property until the 19th century legally does not yet empower people who look like me. And we're so surprised that a document that did not allow women the right to participate in our democracy through voting, let alone the right to have land or a bank account until the 20th century, is in need of an update. Well, I'm not surprised. Actually, I'm pissed. I stand today as one of the vice chairs, the new vice chairs of the ERA caucus, to demand the obvious need for a constitutional amendment so that our future daughters and granddaughters, mine and yours, are not discussing what we failed to do in the 21st century. Yes, I stand today frustrated that it's not obvious to all elected members of Congress that the rights of all women, and specifically black women, need to be protected. As we are wrapping Women's History Month, I remain steadfast in making sure that our daughters and granddaughters of the future do not have to continue to discuss this. Constitutional equality is powerful. Women and states have done their part to ratify the ERA, as we've heard, including our new colleague who is joining us in the 118th. But now Congress must swiftly follow suit. We must take this action to move one step closer to enshrining the dignity, the humanity, and the equality of all people into the highest law in the land. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield my time back.
I thank the Honorable Congresswoman Summer Lee for her remarks from the great state of Pennsylvania. It is now my pleasure to introduce, my privilege to yield to the Honorable Congresswoman from the great state of Virginia, Jennifer McClellan. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to Representative Jackson for convening this special order, and Representative Cori Bush and Ayanna Pressley for your leadership in creating the Congressional ERA caucus. I rise today as the first black woman to represent Virginia, the birthplace of American democracy and the birthplace of American slavery. I rise as the former state legislator who led Virginia to become the 38th and final state necessary to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And it is poetic justice that Virginia was the final state necessary for ratification. It's been a long march towards equality in Virginia's history. In 1619, when the first women were recruited to Jamestown, it was to make wives to the inhabitants, and their rights were surrendered to their husbands. They couldn't vote, they couldn't hold public office, they couldn't control their own property. African American women who arrived in 1619 were considered property and had fewer rights, if any at all. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence established the principle that all men were created equal with inalienable rights. They didn't mean me. And when the Constitution was developed for we the people in order to form a more perfect union, it didn't include me. The Constitution purported to create a government by, of, and for the people, but not for me, only for white men. And for the past centuries, we've made major progress to secure the blessings of liberty for every American, thanks to the struggle and sacrifice of black women who were in the fight from the beginning, but were the last to benefit from our work. We were there in the fight to abolish slavery. As you heard, we were there in the fight for women's suffrage
even when we were told to march in the back. We marched for civil rights in the 1960s, even though we weren't given a speaking role. We have fought, organized, and marched for ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment for over 100 years. And it is absurd that 100 years after the ERA's introduction, that women still do not have the same constitutional rights as men. That is why I am not only committed, but honored to carry on this fight in Congress with my sisters in this fight, with Representatives Bush and Presley in the Congressional ERA caucus. Women across our nation have waited too long for equality. It is our time. Publish the ERA today so that tomorrow our daughters don't have to fight this same fight. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Representative Jennifer McClellan, our newest member. Mr. Speaker, you've heard from my distinguished colleagues about our topic on ERA, all issues of great importance to the Congressional Black Caucus. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back to the Honorable Richard McCormick from the great state of Georgia, my fellow HBCU graduate.
Thank you, sir. And
I motion to adjourn.